Monday, August 5th. It rained most of the weekend, and I spent a good part of Saturday and Sunday in the house reading. Late Sunday afternoon it began to clear, and Uncle Al and I went outside. The rain had been quite heavy, and the water had flooded down the driveway, washing half the gravel into the grass. He was completely disgusted. "This has happened every year. There's been a heavy rainstorm for the past 10 years, he said. Now there's a research project for you, or an engineering job, whatever you want to call it. Figure out some way that my driveway and maybe half the lawn doesn't get flooded every time there's a hard rain." Although it had stopped raining, water was still flowing down the driveway. It came from a ditch beside the highway in the front of our place. When we walked up the road, we saw that there was at least 2 feet of water in the ditch. "The main trouble is that culvert there," said Uncle Al. "The water from our half of the road flows down on this side and into the ditch. It's supposed to go through that culvert and on down the other side of the road to the creek, but 9/10 of the time the culvert is clogged. As a result, we have a flood." The culvert that he was talking about is really just a big corrugated galvanized steel pipe which runs underneath the road. "The trouble is, it isn't big enough," I said. "That is a very astute observation," said Uncle Al, "and it's one that I made about 9 or 10 years ago. I made it at regular intervals to the highway department ever since. When I complained, they send a man out and he pokes a stick in there or something to get out the leaves and debris, and that's all. It works reasonably well for several rains, and then clogs up again, and we have the same trouble. The last 3 houses on this side of the road have had their front lawns flooded at least 3 or 4 times a year for I don't know how long." "Couldn't you put some sort of screen over this end?" I asked. "I tried that," Uncle Al said. "Then the stuff just clogs up and blocks the entrance to the culvert. It's a bit easier to clean away the debris that way, but that's all. It clogs up quicker, and to keep the culvert operating, I'd have to stand out there in a pair of hip boots all the time it was raining. I don't want to do that. I prefer a roof over my head when it rains." I said that I would give the problem my attention, and I did. I thought about it several times, but I couldn't figure out an answer, except, of course, to put in a much larger culvert. I did get a long bamboo pole from the garage and poked it through the culvert. I managed to dislodge a big glob of sticks and leaves, and then the water began to go through much faster. However, there wasn't any doubt that Uncle Al was right, and it would soon clog up again the next time it rained. It was a nice day today, and while the ground was soft and wet, I dug some earthworms and put them in the bathtub. Then, since we were out of straw, I got Uncle Al's tractor and cart, and we went over to Mr. Baines's farm for another bale. On the way back, we stopped by the new house to watch them put up the roof rafters. The man with the bulldozer had finished his work and was gone, and only one of the carpenters who had been stung was still there. He wasn't sore at us any longer. I don't know why he was ever sore in the first place. After all, we couldn't know that the plumber was going to be such a reckless driver. I had expected that we would have to keep Agony on a leash after our last talk with Mr. Apple, but Uncle Al said no. He warned me to keep the dog away from Mr. Apple's property as much as I could, and said that we could wait and see what they did about their cat. Agony disappeared someplace, and I didn't pay too much attention. Then I heard his rabbit voice, and I could tell from the tones that he was after the white rabbit again. That wouldn't have bothered me except that he was on the wrong side of the road. The white rabbit goes back and forth across the road from Midge's house to my lot quite often. I don't know how he manages to avoid being run over by cars, and sometimes when I am annoyed, I hope that he will be. I guess he is just as smart about avoiding cars as he is about not being caught. I don't worry about him, but I do worry about Agony. Agony does not chase cars. He stays out of the road, and when he crosses the road, he's very careful about it. But when he starts chasing that rabbit, he forgets there are such things as roads or cars. Several times he has located the rabbit on Midge's side of the street, and after chasing around over there for a while, the rabbit invariably heads for my lot. I guess all the woodchuck holes in the woods in the back make this his safest place. 2 or 3 times they have streaked across the road, neither one paying any attention to whether there are any cars coming or not. Although there isn't much traffic on the road, 1 car is all that's needed. There would be a dead dog or dead rabbit. As soon as I heard Agony barking on Midge's side of the road, I started running down the road to locate him. I was about opposite Uncle Al's house when I heard him in the backyard of the Ainsworths. At least, that's where I thought he was. I was running in that direction when suddenly they came directly toward me. About 15 seconds later, they went flashing by, headed for the road. I shouted for Agony, but he didn't pay the slightest bit of attention. I rushed through the shrubbery in front of the Ainsworths just in time to see the rabbit tear down the bank with Agony close behind him. Agony was really giving Jedediah a run for his money. He was only about 3 feet behind him, and he was gaining. The rabbit was either tired or was getting fat. Of course he should be getting fat. He eats the best out of everybody's garden. Instead of crossing the road, the rabbit went straight along the bottom of the ditch. When he got opposite Uncle Al's, he made a sudden and abrupt turn and disappeared in the steel culvert. Agony tried to stop him, but he skidded about 3 feet before he could turn around. Then he poked his nose in the culvert, hesitated for a moment, and disappeared inside. I looked up and down the road. No cars were coming, so I made a mad dash across to the other end of the culvert. I got there just too late. I was hoping that the culvert would be blocked and that the rabbit would be trapped inside, but he wasn't. I was almost there when he came scrambling out the other end in front of Uncle Al's house. He was muddy and dirty, and he was scared, but he got through. I made a leap for him and missed him. He hopped up the bank and disappeared in the rhododendrons in Aunt Mabel's front yard. Midge started the tractor, and she drove up beside me. "What happened?" she asked. "Agony almost had the rabbit," I said. "He was gaining on him fast when the rabbit ducked into the culvert." "Agony is always gaining on him," Midge said. "The trouble is he starts too far behind. Is the rabbit still in the culvert?" "No, he managed to get through," I said. "Agony hasn't come out yet." I leaned down to look in the culvert, but it was black inside. "Here, Agony," I called. Agony gave a whine. I could hear him scratching, but nothing else. "Come on, boy," I called. "Come on out of there." "I'd hide too if I couldn't catch a big fat pet rabbit," Midge said. "He's not hiding," I said. "I think he's stuck." I went to the other end of the culvert and called, but Agony didn't come out. Now and then I'd hear him scratching and he'd whine, but we couldn't see a thing from either end. I went inside the house and got a flashlight. I could just see Agony's tail and hind end from one end of the culvert, and from the other end I thought I could see a tip of his nose, but I wasn't sure. I had poked out most of the sticks Sunday afternoon, but there was still plenty of dirt inside and leaves and other junk. I got a long pole and put a wire on the end and managed to pull out an old, rusty tin can, but that didn't accomplish anything except to let me see a little better. Agony seemed to be stuck right in the middle of the culvert, and I couldn't reach him with the pole from either end. Even if I had been able to reach him, I couldn't have done anything except poke him. "How in the world are we going to get him out of there?" Midge asked, getting worried. "I don't know," I said. "I'll have to figure out some way." I sat down by the edge of the road to think about the problem. Midge is the kind of girl who believes in action. She doesn't think you can accomplish anything while you're sitting still. Maybe your brain is connected to her arms and legs and won't move unless they do. She called Agony from first one end of the culvert and then the other. Then she poked around with the stick and practically burned out the flashlight. Since she had to get down on her knees in the ditch to look in the culvert and the bottom of the ditch was still muddy, she was certainly a sad-looking sight. She had mud all over her legs, her hands, her arms, and even her face. Finally, she stuck her head inside the culvert to get a better look and came out really streaked with mud. To make matters worse, she got something in her eye. "Don't just sit there, you big boob," she said, half crying because of the dirt in her eye. At that moment, a woman in a green station wagon came driving by. Maybe she thought Midge had an accident or something. Anyhow, she stopped. "Is there anything wrong?" she asked. "Agony's inside the culvert," Midge sighed, wiping tears from her eyes. "He's stuck and I can't get him out." "Who's Agony?" "A dog," Midge replied. "He went in after a rabbit and now he can't get out. I'm afraid he'll suffocate, or if he doesn't do that, he'll starve in time." "Are you certain you can't get him out?" "He's right in the middle," Midge replied. "And we've called him and all the times he's whine. I can't even touch him with this long pole." The woman got out of her car to investigate, or help. I don't know which. She had on a tight tan silk dress, and she was dressed to go somewhere special. She took one look at the mud in the ditch at both ends of the culvert and decided that she would take Midge's word for it. Just then, Agony let out a howl that reverberated back and forth in the culvert, making an awful racket. Anyone who doesn't know beagles would have sworn that he was dying of pain. "I wonder who would help," the woman said. "You call the fire department to get animals down from high places, and the police are usually helpful." She paused for a moment, then said suddenly, "There were some men working half a mile back on the highway." She jumped in her car, turned around, and disappeared down the road. I took another look at the culvert, but I couldn't see much. The flashlight gave only a weak glimmer. I went into the house to get 2 new batteries, and by the time I came back, the woman was back again. "Don't you worry," she told Midge. "Those men will be here in a minute. They're finished, whatever they're doing, and we're coming this way anyhow." Midge thanked the woman, who said she had an engagement to keep, and drove on. You often see repair crews of 3 or 4 men in a truck fixing holes in blacktop roads. I thought that the woman had talked to a crew like that, but about 5 minutes later a whole procession came rumbling down the road. "Holy Ned, we have an entire construction gang coming," I said to Midge. In the lead was a station wagon, followed by 3 big trucks, one of those big air compressor rigs, and a crawler power shovel loaded on a flatbed trailer. Way off in the distance was a huge roller chugging along slowly but steadily. "Just pretend he's your dog," I told Midge. "Men always are more sympathetic with little girls rather than boys. Act as though you're worried sick." "I am worried sick," said Midge. "Aren't you?" "Not particularly," I said. "Not now." The station wagon pulled into Uncle Al's driveway, and a man in a khaki shirt got out. "Where's this dog that's caught in the culvert?" he asked. "Right in there," said Midge, doing a perfect job of looking anxious and forlorn. The man got down on his knees and looked in the end of the culvert where Midge was standing. She handed him the flashlight. "I can see his tail," he announced. He got up and came over to my end of the culvert and looked in there. "He has certainly got himself stuck in the middle, hasn't he? And by the middle, too, it seems." The 3 trucks had stopped by this time, and the truck drivers were all gathered around. They seemed to think this was a big joke, and even Midge grinned a little. She has a peculiar sense of humor. The big air compressor and the truck hauling the power shovel pulled up beside the road and stopped. Mr. Ainsworth came out of his house and walked over to see what was going on. I could see that we were soon going to have a crowd. The foreman, or whoever the man was who was in charge, got up from the ditch and brushed the dirt off his knees. "I don't know how to get him out of there except with a can opener," he said. "That culvert looks pretty rusty," said one of the truck drivers. "Yes, it's pretty well shot," the foreman agreed. "It's probably good for a couple of years more at the most." He looked at a short, stocky man wearing horn-rimmed glasses who had been driving the air compressor rig. "How long do you think it will take, Jim?" he asked. The man rubbed his chin. "We could rip up the surface in half an hour or so and have that culvert out of there by 4:30. The new culvert is apt to be the hitch. If that arrives the first thing in the morning, we should have everything cleaned up and be away from here by 11. "Well, that won't be too bad. We're a little bit ahead of schedule anyhow, and I guess this classifies as a real emergency," the foreman said. "Take these 2 trucks on in, but the rest of you start ripping this culvert out." In less than 10 minutes, there were 3 men with air hammers cutting a strip from the blacktop straight across the road. Another truck arrived, loaded with signs, and the foreman set it off to put up detour signs at the 2 nearest corners. The power shovel was unloaded from the truck and moved over, ready for use. "Have you got a telephone, son?" the foreman asked. "I've got a couple of calls to make." I took him into our house to make the phone calls, and on the way I said, "That culvert's too small anyhow. It gets blocked up every time it rains, and floods all the lawns on this side of the road." "I think there's been a complaint or 2 about that. Well, I suppose we might just as well put in a larger one while we're at it." He looked at me and grinned. "How big a one would you suggest?" "Big enough for me to crawl through," I replied. "Then if Agony gets stuck again, I could crawl in and get him." "That's an idea," he said thoughtfully. "I wonder why no kids have ever been stuck in a culvert. They've been stuck every place else." After they had cut through the blacktop, they struck the softer dirt underneath. The power shovel was moved into position and it began digging. By 2:30 in the afternoon, they had dug a big, wide trench and were only a few inches above the culvert. They dug down on each side of it until it was laying in an open at the bottom of a wide ditch. Next, they dug a hole underneath the middle of the culvert, hooked a chain onto it, and hooked that on the dipper of the shovel. A couple of minutes later, the culvert was hanging in the air like a pencil tied to a string. It was almost perfectly balanced in the middle, and first one end and then the other would swing up. Agony was scared. He started howling like mad. I'll bet the late arrivals were puzzled to see that long culvert hanging in the air with those weird sounds coming out of it. "Which end did he go in?" the foreman asked. I showed him, and he pushed down on that until the culvert was tilted up in the air, about 2 feet above the bottom of the ditch. Then 2 men banged on it with crowbars. Agony howled and they banged, and a minute later he came sliding out the lower end, followed by a whole mess of mud and leaves. Everyone shouted in approval, and I jumped down in the ditch to see how Agony was. Before I reached him, he got on his feet and shook his head as though bewildered by it all. Then he scampered across through the trench that had been dug, headed toward Uncle Al's house. I thought he was scared and was getting out of there as fast as he could. Instead, when he reached the other side of the road, he began sniffing around the grass and bushes and suddenly began baying and went kiting across the front yard. All of us stood staring at him in amazement. "You say he chased a rabbit in there?" the foreman asked. "Yes, the rabbit went on through." "And out that end?" "That's right." The foreman shook his head. "Now that's a real hunting dog for you," he said. "He's trapped in a culvert for 3 or 4 hours, and when he gets out, what does he do? He picks up the trail and keeps right on going. Son, if you ever want to sell that dog, let me know." The new culvert didn't arrive, and at 4:30 all the men left, leaving their equipment parked beside the road. People who normally came home by our road found it blocked with a sign saying, "No through traffic." They all had to detour about 2 miles out of their way. It seemed that everyone who lived in Grover's Corner itself came from the wrong direction. When they arrived at the trench, they couldn't get across it to their houses. Most of them left their cars parked at the neighbors rather than drive all the way around. Uncle Al was lucky. He came home from the right direction and was able to get in his driveway. He parked his car and came over to where Midge and I was inspecting the road equipment. "What's happening?" "They're putting in a bigger culvert," I replied. "How big?" he asked. "Big enough for me to crawl through," I said. At least, when the man asked me what size I thought we needed, that's what I told him. Uncle Al seemed sort of weak. He leaned against the air compressor. "How did you manage it?" he asked. "Don't tell me you blew up the old culvert." "No, it was all by accident," I said. "Agony was trapped in it." Between us, Midge and I told him the story. When we had finished, he pulled $5 from his wallet and handed it to Midge. "He's the president of that research firm of yours. I suppose you're the treasurer. We didn't agree on any fee to solve this problem or getting a bigger culvert, but it's certainly worth at least $5 to me, and I've got to admit, you gave me prompt service." "But you didn't owe us anything," I said. "It was entirely an accident. We didn't plan for Agony to get trapped." "Maybe not," Uncle Al replied, "but you've got a way of making accidents happen. Here, take $5. Midge took the $5. "Hank did tell him that we needed a bigger culvert," she said, "so I suppose we earned something. We're going to get a cement one this time." As long as the man thought he could get Agony out by digging up the culvert, I wasn't going to argue with him, I said. Uncle Al looked at me suspiciously. "Did you have some other way of getting him out?" "Yes." "What did you mean when you said you weren't worried about him getting out?" Midge asked. "Oh, I knew how to get him out of there," I said. "I figured that out just before they got here." "How?" Uncle Al demanded. "I was going to hook up the garden hose," I said. "I'd let the water run through the culvert and it would wash the dirt out. I thought it might take an hour or two, but the mud in there was still soft. Agony might have gotten a little wet, but eventually he'd be able to go on through." Uncle Al ran his hand down over his face and walked off, muttering to himself. I don't know what was wrong with him. Maybe he thinks that wouldn't have worked, but I'm sure it would have.